Hi everyone, this is the lecture to accompany Chapter 15 in your textbook. There's so much information in Chapter 15. You definitely need to read it and make notations in MindTap. It's very important for you to understand this information. And this is just a brief overview to get you started. Okay, let's talk about argument. First, let's talk about what an argument isn't, at least in respect to this class. Argument is not a disagreement with someone where you say something and someone else says you're wrong and possibly how stupid you are for thinking that way. And it can get pretty nasty and involve your relatives and your sexuality and your intelligence level. But that's not what I'm talking about. That's not what argument is, in the sense in which we use it in this class. Argument is simply a claim that you make and you back it up with evidence and reasoning. It's not unusual. We do it all the time. Here's a kind of argument we might see when trying to convince our significant other that it's time for a new cell phone. The claim that you want the other person to believe is, I need a new cell phone. You're making an assertion that you want the other person to accept as fact. You want them to say, oh yeah, you're right, you do need a new cell phone. So now you need some evidence to back up that claim. These are the examples, definitions, testimony, or whatever you're using to support your claim. In this case, you have several reasons why you believe your initial claim's true. First, you can say, I've noticed the battery life on my old phone is diminishing, and through my research, I found that a new battery cost as much as the phone did originally. You could also say, even though I've consistently updated, the updates are no longer helping this phone work properly. Another thing you could say is, according to the Apple website, the new phones have better cameras, and I use my camera a lot for my work. And finally, you could say something like, my cell phone carrier has a special offer this month on a new phone. My monthly payment wouldn't increase. Finally, the reasoning process links the evidence back to the claim. In this case, it's fairly obvious. As this person says, each of these reasons individually are pretty good reasons to get a new phone, but if you add them all up together, this person has made an excellent case for getting a new phone. This form of reasoning is called inductive reasoning, which we'll discuss later. Suffice it to say that this is a fairly strong inductive argument and the kind of thing that we do all the time. So let's look at each part of an argument. The claim is the position or assertion you want the audience to accept. There are two different types of claims. The conclusion, or the primary claim, which is the thesis sentence of your speech. The main overall claim that you want the audience to accept. Don't confuse this term with the conclusion of your speech. That's a different thing altogether. The other type of claim is called a premise. These are reasons to support the conclusion. In a speech, you can consider each of your main points to be a premise, or a smaller argument that you need to prove in order to prove your thesis. Sometimes there are indicator words that help you to determine what is a premise and what's a conclusion. For conclusions, you might see the word therefore, or consequently, or so. For premises, you might see the words because, or in light of, or since. This example has an indicator word for the premise, because, and so we know that the other part of the sentence is the conclusion. So the speaker's arguing that the reason we should continue our trade agreements with them is because they've been our longtime ally. You need to understand the claims because their assertions can always be challenged. So you need to make your claims as reasonable as possible so the audience will be more likely to accept them. A qualifier, like probably, likely, often, or usually, helps the audience understand the strength of the claim you're making. And hardly anything is ever 100% absolutely true, especially when you're speculating about what might happen. For instance, if you say smoking causes cancer, you're making an assertion that the act of smoking leads inevitably to cancer. Now, you might think that's true, when in fact only about 10% of long-term smokers actually develop lung cancer. This is not to say that smoking doesn't cause any health issues. It absolutely does. 50% of smokers will make it to old age, but the other 50% will fall victim to, if not cancer, then heart disease, stroke, or COPD. So to say smoking causes cancer is incorrect, and it can be refuted by one person in the audience whose Uncle Joe is 95, smokes a pack a day, and still works his farm in Oklahoma. What is a better claim to make would be something like, smoking often causes health issues and smokers may face a reduced lifespan. Now that's qualified. The often and the may qualify this claim. That's a much easier claim to prove than smoking causes cancer. Evidence is what you use to show that the claims you're making are true. Back in Chapter 1, we talked about the ways that people are persuaded through logos, ethos, pathos, and mythos. Logos is the appeal to our logical side. When you use supporting material like facts, statistics, and expert testimony, you're using logical appeal to prove your point. Ethos, which is the credibility of the speaker, rests on the degree to which the audience believes you to be competent and trustworthy. If you can show them you're knowledgeable and enthusiastic about your topic, they'll be more likely to believe you. Pathos, or appeals to emotion, relies on the stimulation of feelings in the audience. Telling stories, giving personal examples, using the testimony of people with whom the audience can relate, these are all ways to use this kind of proof. Finally, mythos, which are appeals to our cultural beliefs and identity. Stories and myths that define a culture, whether they're true, embellished history, or complete fabrications, can be powerful support. The supporting material you choose to use as evidence is key to your success as a persuasive speaker. Here are some guidelines to follow. First, keep your evidence relevant to your topic, not just to the topic, but to the individual point you're trying to make. The audience needs to be able to clearly understand how this piece of evidence supports your claim. If it's only somewhat relevant or you have to spend a long time explaining how it's relevant, don't use it. Find something else. Second, use highly credible sources. That's why I expect you to use the CSN library databases when you research. Remember when we discussed where to find sources and how to determine if the source and the information is valid, current, and credible. Third, use diverse sources or different kinds of sources. Use national, state, and government data. Use newspapers, magazines, journal articles, and websites. Citing a variety of different types of sources in your speech will add to your perceived expertise and enhance your credibility. Finally, use different types of evidence. A speech where the evidence is mostly facts and statistics is going to be pretty boring. A combination of facts, statistics, examples, and narrative gives you much stronger and broader support for your claims. Reasoning is the process by which you link your evidence to the claim, showing how it supports and proves the claim to be true. There are lots of different types of reasoning, but for purposes of our class, we focus on these 4 types: deductive, inductive, causal, and analogical reasoning. Let's look at each of them. The first type of reasoning, deductive reasoning, uses a general principle and applies it to a specific instance to come to a conclusion. It's a more precise and formal kind of reasoning than inductive reasoning, and its main form is often a syllogism. A syllogism consists of 3 claims, which are 2 premises and a conclusion. The first premise is the major premise and is the general principle or statement. In the first example here, the major premise is a generally accepted statement: all triathletes are in excellent physical condition. The second claim is the minor premise, which is the specific instance. In this case, Taylor is a triathlete. So, since it's generally accepted that triathletes have to be in excellent condition to compete, we probably don't need to prove that claim to be true. The minor premise, though, might need some evidence to show that Taylor is indeed a triathlete. However, if that is indeed the case, then there can be only one conclusion to come to: that Taylor is in excellent physical condition. Here's another example of deductive reasoning. Compact fluorescent light bulbs save energy and last longer. The light bulb I bought is compact fluorescent, so it will save energy and last longer. The major premise is the first statement, the minor premise is the second statement, and the conclusion is that the light bulb will save energy and last longer. We use deductive reasoning all the time, but we usually don't state all the parts of the argument. As you can see, these arguments look and sound kind of clunky. We don't generally talk this way. Lots of our deductive arguments are enthymemes, arguments in which either premises or conclusions are implied rather than stated. These last 2 sentences are enthymemes of the above arguments. In each case, the major premise is left out because we assume the audience knows that information already. Inductive reasoning, also known as reasoning by example, asks the audience to accept a conclusion based on a number of specific instances or examples. Inductive reasoning is less precise than deductive reasoning. The way deductive reasoning is set up, there can only be one conclusion, but inductive reasoning is based on probability, as in the more examples you have, the more probable it is that your conclusion is correct. Look at this example. I loaned Joaquin $20 in January and he hasn't paid me back. I loaned him $20 in February and he hasn't paid me back. I loaned him $20 in March and he hasn't paid me back. He's probably never going to pay me back. Now, based on these examples, that conclusion may indeed be correct, but there's nothing saying that it's absolutely true, and you can't come to any other conclusion than that. He might actually pay me back. You could also reach some other conclusion based on these three premises, like the conclusion that I really am one of those people who loans money out too easily, or another conclusion that I should stop loaning him money. Because inductive reasoning involves examples and stories, it can be a very powerful form of reasoning. However, you need to make sure that you have enough evidence to come to a conclusion. One example really isn't enough to show that your conclusion's true. So how do you reason inductively if you don't have time to mention every example of something? Well, that's where statistics come in. You can use them to show that the example you cited is generally the case. We use causal reasoning to argue that one action causes something else to occur. It's particularly useful when you want to explain why something happened, as in this example. I had a nap. When I woke up, I felt great. The nap helped me feel better. But you can also use it to identify who's responsible or who's at fault for something, as in this example. Crime didn't increase until the state cut unemployment benefits. The state legislature is responsible for this spike in the crime rate. You can also use it to determine whether people can control an event like this. I swerved to try to avoid the collision, but my brakes locked and I went into a spin and hit the other car. And it's also helpful for making a guess about what might occur in the future, as in this example. Common sense gun regulations will lead to a decrease in gun-related homicides in our city. While causal reasoning can be very persuasive, you really have to be very careful with it. You must research to make sure the events you're saying are linked, are connected by more than just time. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, just because something happened first and then another thing happened does not mean that the first event caused the second event. You need to prove that those things are indeed causally linked. Also, it's hardly ever the case that a single event is the sole cause of another event. Even if there is some connection between the two events, there might also be other factors at play. Here's where qualifying your claim can come in handy. Say something like the first event is one of the main causes or a significant cause rather than the only cause. An analogy is a comparison. So analogical reasoning is comparing two things and reasoning that because they're alike in a significant way related to the topic, that what's true for one is also true for the other. Here's an example we might use in our daily lives when looking for food for our pet rabbit. We can't find food specifically for rabbits, but we find food that says it's for small pets, and there's a picture of a guinea pig on the package. You think to yourself, well, guinea pigs and rabbits eat hay and vegetables, so my rabbit can probably eat this food in a pinch, at least until I can find the right food. One of the ways analogical reasoning is used in persuasive speeches is when you're talking about putting some law or regulation into effect. You look around to see where else the law's been implemented, and if it happened in a similar place, then you can use that as evidence. Be careful, though. The comparison between the two things must be realistic and believable, and you need to point out the ways in which they are similar so the audience will believe that your conclusion is valid. Arguments, when carefully constructed and well supported, are great. However, a large percentage of the arguments we hear, and even the ones we use ourselves, are flawed, and unfortunately a flawed argument is not less persuasive. Sometimes it's actually more persuasive than a valid or strong argument. An ethical speaker understands their responsibility to create good arguments and to avoid fallacies. Fallacies in argument fall into four main categories. Faulty claims, which are errors in basic assumptions or assertions. Flawed evidence, incorrect, irrelevant, or insufficient evidence to support the claim. Defective reasoning, errors in the reasoning process, which is how the speaker links the evidence to the claim. Or erroneous responses, which are errors in judgment made by the people listening to the argument. Let's look at examples of each of these. Fallacies in claims. In this first kind of fallacy, the error is found in the claim itself. A false dilemma occurs when the speaker ignores all the other choices and claims the audience needs to accept either one thing or the other. That's why it's also known as the either-or fallacy. But in the vast majority of cases, there are alternative things that can be done. So to ignore all other options is not only a fallacy, it can also be an unethical tactic on the part of the speaker. So when this person says we must either raise taxes or cut programs, they really only want you to choose one of them, when there are other things besides raising taxes or cutting programs that you can do. In begging the question, also known as circular reasoning, the claim and the evidence used to prove the claim are essentially the same thing. The Bible is the Word of God because it says so in the Bible. It's kind of like saying, here's my claim and it's true because it's the claim. But it says so in the Bible is not evidence to prove that the Bible is the Word of God. You have to provide support for the claim and not just simply imply the truth of the claim. The slippery slope fallacy occurs when the speaker uses the claim to predict that one event will necessarily lead to another, usually negative event, as in this example. A national identity card is the first step to complete and total loss of privacy for all Americans. While the conclusion might follow from the premise, there really is no evidence provided that it absolutely will. The speaker just wants you to assume that it will. The ad ignorantium, or appeal to ignorance fallacy, is also known as the burden of proof fallacy. It occurs when the speaker says that because something hasn't been proven to be true, then it must be false, or in this case, that it hasn't been proven to be false, so it must be true. You can't prove ghosts don't exist, therefore they must exist. Here's the thing, lack of evidence is not evidence for anything. The person making the claim is the one with the burden of proof. The next kind of fallacy has to do with evidence. An argument is only as good as your support, and evidence that is irrelevant, inaccurate, or insufficient causes your argument to be fallacious. A red herring fallacy occurs when your evidence really has nothing to do with the claim. In this example, the claim is that you have to take that class. The evidence is that there are people who can't afford to go to college. Now, think about it. What does that have to do with you taking a class? Nothing. I suppose the speaker might be trying to make the listener feel guilty, like when your mom told you to eat your food because people in other countries are starving. The evidence being presented here is irrelevant to the claim. Ad populum, also known as the teenager's fallacy because they tend to want to do what everyone else is doing, plays on popularity as the only evidence. You should buy this brand of shoes, everyone is wearing them, is a common advertising tactic. My mom used to say when I'd beg for something that everyone else had, well, if everyone jumped off a cliff, would you do it too? And when I was 14, I probably would have. But anyway, you need better evidence than lots of people are doing it because, frankly, lots of people are stupid. Then there's the comparative evidence fallacy. This has to do with the way audiences can be misled with evidence like statistics if you don't use them properly and ethically. For instance, look at this example. Our town's crime rate has gone up 25% since last year. We need more police protection. At first glance, this sounds like a pretty dire situation. But the thing that's missing here is a number to compare it with. In other words, what was the town's crime rate last year? If it consisted of 2 burglaries and 2 shoplifting incidents, then one more petty crime would be a 25% increase. Does that call for more police protection? I'm not sure that it does. Then there's the appeal to tradition. On the face of it, tradition doesn't sound all that bad and isn't necessarily, unless that's all you have for evidence. Or it could be that the tradition is based on ideas that are outmoded and potentially dangerous, like, say, racism or misogyny. Those are not good things. If that's all you've got for evidence, your argument isn't very good. Then there are fallacies that arise from the reasoning process. In the division fallacy, the speaker assumes that what's generally true for something means that it's always true. In this case, that the majority of voters in Texas are registered Republicans. Okay, that's probably true, but that doesn't mean that everyone in Texas is a Republican. So you can see the reasoning here is faulty. Then there's the hasty generalization fallacy, which is a fallacy of inductive reasoning. Remember, inductive reasoning is reasoning by example, and in hasty generalization, you're coming to a conclusion on the basis of too few examples. One example doesn't mean anything. For instance, this. Captain Holly Graff, the former commanding officer of the Navy vessel USS Cowpens, was relieved of duty because of abusive behavior. This example proves that women are unfit for military command. Really? One example of a terrible commander who happens to be a woman, and the conclusion is that no woman is fit to command? That's a really bad argument. Then there's the post hoc fallacy. Actually, it's called post hoc ergo propter hoc, which means after this, therefore because of this. This fallacy uses cause-effect reasoning incorrectly by saying that because something happened first, whatever happened next was caused by the first event. Remember, I told you that time couldn't be the only things linking two events together for one to cause the other one. There has to be an actual causal link. So this example, you didn't have a headache until after you'd eaten lunch. Obviously, there's something wrong with that food. So the example links the person's headache with what they ate for lunch, although the only evidence used was that lunch came first, then the headache. But there could have been any number of causes for a headache, so blaming it solely on what you had for lunch is fallacious without more evidence. Weak analogy fallacy incorrectly compares two things that are fundamentally different in the relevant way. Here's an example you've probably seen before. Guns and hammers are both made of metal and can be used to kill people, but it would be ridiculous to regulate the sale of hammers, so the regulation of firearms is equally ridiculous. While lots of people have used this argument, it is fallacious. While guns and hammers certainly do have the things in common stated here, they are fundamentally different in both their construction and their general purpose, how and why they're used. And that's the relevant point. So guns and hammers are not alike enough in the relevant way to come to a conclusion that guns shouldn't be regulated. Speakers aren't the only ones who commit logical fallacies. Audience members who are listening to arguments are equally guilty. Here are some of the ways in which their logic can fail them. The ad hominem fallacy is so commonplace we don't often realize we're committing it. We see it all the time in politics and on social media, so we think it's okay, but it's not. Basically, it's simply trashing the person putting forth a claim rather than actually addressing the claim itself, then rejecting the claim because we reject the person. As in this example, what do you know about feeding the poor? Your family's rich. The book puts it like this. You want me to accept your thesis, but I don't like you, or I don't like some quality or characteristic I perceive that you possess. So I reject your position. It's ad hominem when you're listening to someone and think, who would believe anything that idiot says? You're not critiquing what they're saying, you're critiquing who they are and rejecting their ideas based solely on that. And as I said, it's so common we don't even consider it wrong. But it is unethical and something you really need to check yourself on. It's fine to look at the other person's argument and decide that it's not a good argument, but it's not fine to judge the person and reject their argument without even considering its merits. Then there's guilt by association, which is closely related to ad hominem. In it, the person links the claim to something they find repulsive or objectionable. This example, Denmark is satisfied with their socialist society. Yeah, well, Venezuela is a socialist country, and look what happened to them. This implies that Denmark's socialist society is bad because of a failing socialist country like Venezuela. Denmark is somehow guilty based on what happened in Venezuela because they have some things in common. But just because they're both socialist societies doesn't make Denmark bad. Then there's the straw man fallacy, where a claim is misrepresented to the point that it becomes ridiculous and therefore easy to refute. You see this all the time in political advertisements where the opponent's position is distorted and exaggerated to the point where it can be ridiculed and dismissed. So here's an example. Teaching about contraception in schools is just an open invitation for kids to have sex. The claim that a candidate might make about the importance of sex education in schools is made to seem as if the candidate is encouraging kids to have sex, which is not the case. Finally, the loaded word fallacy uses emotionally laden words to distract from the speaker's argument and cause an emotional reaction in the audience. This final example, and you probably know where this quote came from, actually contains all of the fallacies on this slide. It uses ad hominem attacks on Democrats. It uses guilt by association to link immigrants as a whole with MS-13 gang members. It uses straw man to misrepresent and dismiss the whole immigration issue, and of course it uses lots of loaded words and phrases to make an emotional argument that is devoid of logic. Particularly troubling is the use of the word infest to describe immigrants coming into the country, as if these people were insects or animals that need extermination. This kind of loaded language is often used to justify the dehumanization of groups of people, and that tends to happen before atrocities are committed on them. Emotions are by far the most persuasive of all the proofs, so you need to be on guard against being pulled in by loaded language. Okay, we've learned a lot about arguments, but there's still more for you to learn, so head on over to MindTap.